I'm 91 years old. If you're afraid to live alone, don't go to a nursing home. Do this instead. People often assume that as you reach my age, the greatest fear that shadows your days is the thought of dying alone. But that, I have learned, is a profound misunderstanding. My fear was never about the final breath, not truly. It was about the long, drawn-out process of living, and specifically what they, the well-meaning, the efficient, the managerial, might do to me while I was still drawing those breaths, while I was still capable of independent thought and feeling. There is a fundamental difference between facing the inevitability of death and grappling with the prospect of losing oneself, one's autonomy, one's very essence, long before the end comes. If you happen to be approaching my advanced years, or if you are reading this because someone you cherish dearly is, I implore you to truly grasp this distinction. It is not a subtle nuance, but a foundational truth upon which the entire narrative I am about to share rests. Every word, every memory, every hard-won lesson is illuminated by this singular, potent fear. My name is Cecily Maroro, and I am, as of this moment, 91 years old. In the span of these 9 decades, I have worn many skins, experienced countless transformations. I have been a devoted daughter, a loving wife to Gerald, a nurturing mother to my children, and a resilient widow. For the past 6 years, I have also been something else entirely, a woman who lives deliberately alone in a house that echoes with memories, a house that is undeniably too large and often unsettlingly quiet, yet it is entirely, stubbornly, and beautifully mine. Every creak, every faded pattern on the wallpaper, every dust mot in the sunbeam holds a fragment of my life, a piece of my story. I have weathered the unimaginable grief of burying my husband, Gerald, whose absence still carves an ache into my heart. I have said my final goodbyes to 2 of my closest, dearest friends, leaving holes in my social fabric that can never truly be mended. I have watched my children mature into adults, people capable of profound love, yet whose love for me often manifests in a worry that feels both deeply touching and at times profoundly suffocating, sometimes all within the same afternoon tea. And I have spent more hours than I could ever possibly count, sitting in that familiar armchair by the window, the one upholstered in an unapologetic shade of green, which Gerald, with his characteristic dry wit, always insisted clashed with everything, contemplating the stark reality of what it means to be old in a world that, with increasing regularity, views old age not as a stage of life to be honored or lived, but as a complex problem to be efficiently managed. It is precisely this subject, this pervasive societal attitude towards aging, that I wish to discuss with you. I want to transport you back to a pivotal year, the year my daughter, Margaret, in her boundless and often overwhelming concern, became utterly convinced that I needed help. I will recount what transpired as we embarked on the journey to find this elusive help, and more importantly, what we ultimately stumbled upon instead. Let me be clear from the outset, this is not one of those neatly packaged tales with a perfectly resolved ending. There is no singular dramatic moment where every character experiences an epiphany, where all misunderstandings are swept away and everything suddenly falls into place. Life, particularly at 91, simply doesn't operate with such convenient narrative arcs. But this, I assure you, is an undeniably true story. And at my age, truth, unvarnished and uncompromised, is the only currency I possess, the only kind of narrative I have any genuine interest in conveying. Let us begin on a particularly unremarkable Tuesday in November. November, a month that always feels tinged with a quiet melancholy, a sense of transition. The trees outside my window had long since shed their autumnal finery, standing skeletal and bare against the pewter sky. The light, too, was that particular flat, diffuse gray that drains the color from the world, making everything appear a little defeated, a little weary. At this point, I had been living alone for 4 years, a precise 4 years and 3 months since Gerald had slipped away in his sleep, leaving behind a silence that was almost a physical presence in the house. I was managing, or rather, I am managing. I always have. I prepared my own meals, nourishing myself with simple, familiar foods. I maintained the house, sweeping away the dust that accumulated with surprising speed, keeping everything in its proper place. I paid my bills, a task that, despite years of practice, still felt like performing an intricate magic trick with online banking, a digital feat I only partially comprehended. Every morning, without fail, I would walk slowly, deliberately, to the end of my block and back, a small ritual that affirmed my continued connection to the world outside my door. On Sundays, I would make my calls to my grandchildren, listening to their vibrant, chaotic lives unfold through the receiver. I read voraciously, losing myself in stories, and I followed my television programs, a comforting routine in the evenings. By any objective, reasonable measure, I was a woman who was not merely existing, but actively getting on with things. However, Margaret, my daughter, had been watching me with an intensity that made me feel like a fragile, antique vase, the way one watches a beloved possession, bracing for the inevitable crack, the eventual breakage. And so, that November the phone rang, and her voice, usually so bright and bustling, carried a certain gravitas as she said, "Mom, I think we need to talk." As a mother who has navigated decades of unspoken communications and subtle signals, I recognized the quiet alarm in her tone. I knew with an instinctive certainty that settles deep in your bones that the conversation she felt compelled to initiate was not one I was destined to enjoy. She arrived the following Saturday, not alone, but with my son-in-law, David, in tow. His presence immediately amplified the seriousness of the situation. David, bless his practical, unpretentious heart, generally approaches visits to my house with the same resigned necessity one might reserve for a trip to the dentist. It's not inherently unpleasant, not exactly, but it's certainly not something he'd ever volunteer for. He is, to his credit, a genuinely good man, kind and steady, but he reliably exhausts his conversational repertoire with a 90-year-old woman after about 40 minutes, and I have always harbored a quiet respect for his inability, or perhaps his refusal, to feign otherwise. He settled himself at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, and sensibly allowed Margaret to take the lead in the impending discussion. "Mom," she began, her voice carefully modulated, "we've been thinking," and that innocuous "we," that collective pronoun, spoke volumes. It told me everything I needed to know. This was not a nascent thought that had sprung fully formed into Margaret's mind, a solitary worry. No, this was a fully fleshed-out discussion, meticulously dissected and deliberated upon by Margaret and David, probably late at night in their own kitchen, long after their children were safely tucked into bed. It was the way parents often talk about sensitive matters, in hushed tones, hoping to shield their children from uncomfortable truths. Except, in this particular and acutely painful instance, I was the child. She continued, "We've been thinking that perhaps it's time to talk about your options." Options. Even now, 6 years removed from that moment, the word still grates. I have always held a deep-seated distrust for that particular word when it's deployed in the way Margaret used it then. In that specific context, it rarely signifies true freedom of choice. More often than not, it's a polite linguistic veneer, concealing the uncomfortable truth that a decision has already been largely made and the options are merely predetermined pathways presented to give the illusion of agency. I did not voice this then. The words remained unspoken, carefully contained within the confines of my own mind, but I am saying it now, loud and clear, because now, finally, I can. Then I simply sat across from my daughter, her face etched with a familiar concern, and looked at her. She has Gerald's forehead, always did. Wide and honest, a feature that always softened him in my eyes. And in that moment, I saw something that shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. She was frightened, not of me, but for me. And that recognition changed everything. You can feel a surge of annoyance, even righteous indignation, when someone acts wrongly towards you, but it becomes infinitely more difficult to sustain that annoyance when you perceive that their actions are born of a genuine, visceral fear on your behalf. So, I took a steadying breath and said, "All right, Margaret, tell me what you're thinking." And I truly listened. She had arrived prepared, meticulously so. My Margaret. She gets that thoroughness, that meticulousness from me, I suppose. She had even brought a small notebook, its pages filled with neat, precise script. I noticed, with a fleeting, ironic amusement, that she kept it just slightly out of my direct sightline, a gesture I found both considerate, a recognition perhaps of my pride, and faintly amusing, given that it was I who had painstakingly taught her the virtues of organization, and now she was attempting to subtly conceal those very skills from me. She laid out her 3 propositions with the carefully practiced cadence of a presentation. Option 1. I could pack my bags and come to live with her and David, integrating myself into their bustling household. Option 2. They could arrange for a professional caregiver, someone to attend to me during the week, assisting with the house, the shopping, and what she broadly termed the day-to-day necessities. Option 3. And this one she delivered quietly, almost in a murmur, the way you tread softly when conveying something you know might inflict a wound. We could explore communities. These were places, she explained gently, where there was dedicated staff, where there would be other people my age, where crucially I would be safe. I told her I would give it thought, and for 3 long weeks I did. I wrestled with each possibility, turning them over in my mind like smooth, cold stones. Then, honoring the principles of honesty and directness that Gerald and I had always instilled in our children, and feeling a reciprocal obligation to offer them the same candor, I telephoned Margaret. "Let's try your first idea," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll come and stay with you for a while. Let's see how it goes. I want to impress upon you the significance of those 8 weeks. They were not, by any stretch of the imagination, terrible. Not in the way you might envision terrible. Margaret's house, after all, is a bastion of warmth and meticulous upkeep, a testament to her diligent nature, and her children, my great-grandchildren, are an absolute riot, loud, boisterous, and brimming with the unadulterated joy that only the very smallest humans possess. Little Oscar, who was a whirlwind of 4-year-old energy at the time, would clamber onto my lap without a moment's hesitation, as if it were his inalienable right, a natural resting place. I found this unexpectedly, achingly wonderful. It had been years, decades even, since I had felt the comforting weight of a small person in my lap, the specific, vibrant, alive weight of a child who entrusts their entire small body, without question, to your care. I had forgotten that particular sensation, that singular intimacy. But here is the insidious truth about living in your daughter's home when you are 90 years old. You transform with a speed that is almost imperceptible, yet utterly irreversible, into a guest. Not because anyone intends it, not because Margaret and David were anything less than unfailingly kind. They were truly, relentlessly so. And sometimes it was precisely that relentless, unceasing kindness that felt like a door being closed ever so softly in my face. Their lives revolved around a deeply ingrained routine, a beautiful, busy, tightly choreographed dance built over years around their children's school schedules, football, practices, David's demanding work hours, and Margaret's mysterious computer consulting career. I never quite understood the specifics, but I knew it paid well. Into this intricate, established rhythm, I found myself inserted like an antique piece of furniture that simply didn't quite fit, but which everyone, with commendable politeness, agreed to work around. Dinner, for instance, was at precisely 6 o'clock, not because I preferred dinner at 6. Gerald and I had always been late eaters, settling down to our meal at 7:30, sometimes even 8, with the evening news murmuring softly in the background. But 6 was when the children ate, and it was undeniably easier for everyone if we all gathered together. So I ate at 6, and I smiled, and I expressed my gratitude, and a small part of me receded further into the background. I woke, as I always have, at 5 in the morning, long before the first stirrings of the household. I would lie perfectly still in the dark silence of the guest room, careful not to disturb anyone. The guest room, it must be said, boasted a perfectly comfortable mattress. It carried the faint, pleasant scent of the lavender, Margaret meticulously placed in the linens. Objectively lovely, yes, but it was not the scent of my own home. It was not Gerald's smell, which, well, that scent is largely gone from everywhere now, save for fleeting phantom whiffs in the deepest recesses of my wardrobe, a ghost of memory. Perhaps that is just longing, a potent creative force at my age, conjuring what isn't truly there. I endeavored to be useful, to contribute where I could. I read stories to the grandchildren, my voice growing thin but steady. I folded laundry, a task at which I still excel, faster and neater than anyone I've ever known. 60 years of practice will hone such a skill. One Sunday, I made my famous potato soup, and the sight of everyone enjoying 2 generous bowls warmed me more than it probably should have. But despite my efforts, an undeniable truth began to settle. I was also in the way. I overheard it once, a fragment rather than a full sentence. David's voice carrying through the kitchen wall when he didn't realize I was standing in the hallway, fetching a book. Something about the bathroom in the morning and the schedule, followed by Margaret's voice, lower, hushed, then an abrupt silence. I stood there, frozen in the hallway, the words hanging in the air like a pall, and in that moment, a chilling realization washed over me. I am the impediment. I am the thing they are managing around. I have, in my old age, devolved into a schedule problem. I didn't cry then, not in that instant. The tears came later, in the lavender-scented guest room, quietly, my face pressed into the pillow and turned towards the window, so the muffled sobs wouldn't carry through the thin walls. It wasn't exactly sadness that racked me. It was more akin to that peculiar sensation you experience when you've been bearing an impossibly heavy burden for an extended period, and then, for a brief, fleeting moment, you set it down. Your arms, suddenly freed, begin to tremble uncontrollably from the sheer, overwhelming relief of it. It was that kind of shaking, a profound, convulsive crying that stems from the painful, liberating act of finally admitting an unwelcome truth to yourself. The very next morning, I called Margaret. My voice, though still tinged with the residue of my quiet despair, was firm. I told her I wanted to pursue the second option. I heard the undeniable sigh of relief in her response, a subtle exhalation that resonated across the telephone line, and I loved her too much, too deeply to allow myself to be hurt by it. Brenda, the chosen caregiver, arrived on a brisk Monday morning in January. She was a woman of perhaps 55, brisk and undeniably efficient, radiating the professional competence of someone who had navigated the delicate landscape of elderly care for many years, her methods firmly established and rigorously applied. She was not, to be absolutely clear, unkind. Her demeanor was simply, almost clinically, professional. She would arrive promptly at 8 and depart precisely at 4. In the intervening hours, she would meticulously clean my kitchen, often rearranging things with such thoroughness that I would spend the next 3 days in a bewildered search for my everyday utensils. She prepared nutritionally appropriate lunches, invariably devoid of any discernible salt, a decision that, while undoubtedly healthy, stripped the food of all familiar flavor. In the afternoons, she would sit with me in the living room, ostensibly watching television programs. Yet, it was always the shows she chose, the remote control somehow always gravitating towards her grasp. And, perhaps most jarringly, she called me Mrs. Marrow. After 40 years of being simply Cecily to Gerald, Mom to my children, and Grandma Cece to my beloved grandchildren, I was suddenly reduced to a formal title, a stranger in my own home. Mrs. Marrow had been my difficult mother-in-law's name, God rest her thorny soul. The irony was not lost on me, I understand. I know precisely what you might be thinking, what you're expecting me to confess, that I was ungrateful, and perhaps deep down, a sliver of ungratefulness did indeed exist within me. But I feel an urgent need to elucidate something fundamental, something about the profound significance of having a complete stranger suddenly installed in your kitchen when you are old and living alone. My kitchen is not merely a room, it is to me the very heart of my existence, the sacred crucible where nearly every significant event of my life has unfolded. I stood at that very counter, preparing my children's packed lunches for 22 consecutive years, dreaming of their futures, fretting over their scraped knees. I wept into that sink, the cold cold porcelain cool against my cheek. After my own mother passed away, the grief a raw, physical ache. I danced badly, slowly, awkwardly, yet with an unbridled joy. With Gerald in that kitchen, on the unforgettable night we received the news that Margaret had triumphantly passed her medical exams. He with 1 glass of wine, I with 2, both of us so utterly happy, we simply didn't know what else to do with the overflowing emotion. That kitchen, you see, is not just 4 walls and a floor. It is 40 years of my life. Pressed, stained, laughed into, and cried into. Its memories seeped into the very fibers of the walls. And Brenda's presence within it, however well-meaning, however professional, felt disquietingly akin to someone striding casually through a church while a solemn service is still underway. Polite, perhaps, but fundamentally, profoundly wrong. And then there was the matter of the money. I haven't yet delved into the financial realities, but it is a critical, tangible element of this story. Gerald, in his foresight and diligence, had ensured I was comfortable, but certainly not wealthy. My pension, though steady, was modest. Brenda's agency, it turned out, commanded a monthly fee far exceeding what I had mentally prepared for. Margaret, with her characteristic generosity, immediately offered to help, and I, for 3 months, allowed her to. But one quiet evening, I sat down at my kitchen table, the dim light falling across the papers, and I looked at the numbers. I really looked at them, scrutinizing each entry with the same intense focus I used to apply to our household accounts during the lean years. Gerald, a dedicated teacher, and 4 boisterous children meant that most years in our early life were, by necessity, lean. And the stark, unassailable truth solidified in my mind. This arrangement was simply not sustainable. Not without transforming myself into a perpetual financial burden on my daughter. And I have never, not once in my 91 years of living, harbored any desire to be a burden on anyone. I possess, I freely admit, a multitude of flaws, with stubbornness chief among them, according to everyone who has ever claimed to love me. But one unwavering principle has guided my entire life. I have always carried my own weight. So, with a heavy but resolute heart, I called Margaret and instructed her to cancel the agency. Her immediate response was tears. "Margaret, please don't cry," I pleaded, my voice softer than I intended. "This isn't a tragedy, this is simply thinking, a recalculation." She looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed and worried. "Mom, then what?" she asked, her voice tight with unspoken fear. "What do you want to do?" "Let me think," I replied, buying myself a precious moment. She remained silent for a beat, perhaps contemplating the depth of my resolve. Then she spoke again, her tone now imbued with a quiet urgency. "Mom, I need you to also think about the other option, the communities. Just look, just go and look." I promised myself, in the quiet solitude of my thoughts, that I would be fair about this part. I know, acutely, that my singular experience is not the universal experience. I understand, with complete clarity, that there are undoubtedly many assisted living facilities and senior communities that are genuinely good, kind, and managed with the utmost dignity. I will not, therefore, resort to hyperbolic generalizations, painting every such establishment as a mere warehouse for the nearly dead. That would be both fundamentally dishonest and profoundly unkind, particularly to the countless dedicated individuals who labor within those walls, many of whom perform genuinely difficult work with an extraordinary degree of compassion and genuine care. But what I will recount is the visceral, unshakable feeling that enveloped me when Margaret and I visited the particular community she had painstakingly researched and chosen for us to inspect. It was, objectively, a bright and cheerful place. The walls were painted in pleasant, inviting colors. There was a common room, spacious and airy, featuring a grand piano that, rather conspicuously, no one was playing. The gardens outside were beautifully tended, meticulously maintained, a verdant oasis. The staff, without exception, were exceptionally polite, though I found it particularly noteworthy that several of them had already adopted the saccharine endearment, "sweetheart," within mere minutes of our introduction. They guided me to a prospective room, a single room, modest yet functional, featuring a window that overlooked a small, manicured courtyard. Inside, the bathroom was equipped with reassuring handrails, and a brightly laminated board was affixed to the wall, upon which the day's date and a carefully curated list of daily activities were prominently displayed. The schedule for that particular day, I observed, read thus: 9 a.m., morning stretches; 10 a.m., crafts; 12 p.m., lunch; 2 p.m., a film; 4 p.m., social hour. I stood there in that tidy, impersonal room, gazing at that board, and a cascade of thoughts, a lifetime of memories, flooded my mind. I have been making my own decisions, charting my own course, since the year 1935. I have not only survived, but lived through a devastating global depression. I have witnessed and endured a world war. I have lived under the leadership of 4 presidents I genuinely admired, and 6 who, to put it mildly, profoundly disappointed me. For 9 decades, every single day of my life, I have been the sole architect of my decisions, the master of my own time. And now I thought a cheerful young woman, clutching a clipboard with an almost proprietorial air, was going to dictate to me that at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I will watch a film, and at 4 o'clock, I will socialize. I, Cecily Maroro, have never, not once, in my entire long and stubborn life, socialized on a schedule. I managed a tight, polite smile. "How lovely," I said, my voice carefully modulated. I asked a few very polite, entirely innocuous questions. But on the drive home, as I stared out the window of Margaret's car, watching the familiar landscape blur past, a single, unshakable thought solidified within me. Not yet. A quiet, fierce declaration. I am not ready to surrender the very essence of what makes me, me, because the irreducible core of my identity, I realized then, is the fundamental right to decide, entirely and without external decree, what I choose to do at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That right, I understood with a sudden, profound clarity, is not a frivolous luxury. At 91, afterlife has systematically stripped away so much: the presence of my beloved husband, the robust strength of youth, the unwavering steadiness of my hands, the cherished friends who depart, one by one, until you can count the remaining few on a single hand and still have fingers left over. That right, that precious sliver of self-determination, is the last essential thing. And I, Cecily Maroro, was absolutely not ready to hand it over to a clipboard. "Not yet, Margaret," I told her, my voice firm. "Perhaps someday, but most certainly not yet." She was quiet then, a silence that spoke volumes of her worry, her apprehension, but I also sensed beneath the surface of her concern a subtle undercurrent of relief. Relief, I think, to still hear the familiar spark of fight, of unyielding spirit, still vibrant within me. For Margaret, you see, has been listening to that determined fight in me her entire life, even when it wore her down, even when it led to heated arguments. And believe me, we are 2 incredibly stubborn women who, despite our enormous love for each other, occasionally find it impossible to occupy the same room. I believe a part of her would have been far more frightened if that fighting spirit had simply vanished. So there we were. No integration into my daughter's bustling home, no impersonal assistance from an agency, no cheerful community with its preordained 2 o'clock films. Just me, Cecily Maroro, in my too big, too quiet house, with my green armchair and the stubborn, unresolved problem that, despite everyone's well-intentioned efforts, stubbornly remained. What unfolded next was utterly unplanned. I wish to underscore this with utmost clarity. I had no preconceived notion, no clever idea, no meticulously devised strategy. I was not being particularly shrewd or inventive. What transpired was simply this. I was tired, profoundly lonely, and I made the small, almost trivial decision to step outside and retrieve my mail. I understand how utterly insignificant this sounds, but some days, at 91, the act of venturing outdoors to collect the mail registers as an event, a minor expedition. As I reached my mailbox, I noticed a young woman struggling at the box next door. The house that had stood vacant and silent for 2 long years suddenly reawakened in October with new tenants. She was wrestling a cumbersome stroller, juggling a paper bag brimming with groceries, all while a determined toddler had chosen that precise, inopportune moment to stage a sit-down protest on the sun-warmed pavement, refusing to budge. She wore that look, unmistakable and universally understood, the expression of someone who has been valiantly holding the disparate threads of her life together all day and now finds herself with only one hand left, desperately needing just one more. I knew that look in my bones. I had worn it myself for 15 relentless years, raising 4 children, working, and striving to keep every single plate spinning. I recognized it with an almost painful clarity. Without thinking, the words simply slipped out. "Can I hold something?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide and momentarily vacant, the way people do when they've been running so hard, so fast, that they've momentarily forgotten the very existence of other human beings around them. Then her face softened with a flicker of raw gratitude. "Yes," she breathed, "please." I took the flimsy paper bag, its contents jostling lightly in my grasp. She swooped down, deftly scooped up the recalcitrant toddler, Marcus, I would later learn, and 18-month-old with surprisingly strong opinions about pavement, and managed to unfold the stroller, secure the groceries, and settle the baby within. Then she straightened, looked at me again, a self-deprecating smile playing on her lips. "I'm so sorry," she said, a little breathlessly. "I'm such a mess." I couldn't help but return her smile. "I'm Cecily," I replied, "and I'm the opposite of a mess, which, I can tell you, isn't always as good as it sounds." She laughed then, a surprise, genuine burst of sound, the kind that escapes before you can quite catch it. And that, in its beautiful, unassuming simplicity, was how it all began. Not with a grand plan, not with a pre-designed program, but with a simple paper bag and a toddler who stubbornly refused to walk. Her name was Layla, and she was 29 years old. She had moved into the house next door from the other side of the sprawling city, drawn by the promise of a new job. A job that, with the brutal indifference of the modern economy, had been eliminated just 4 short months after her arrival. It was the kind of precarious, sudden reversal that seems to plague young people today, a stark contrast to the relative stability of my own youth. But then, my day had its own distinctive cruelties, and I wouldn't pretend otherwise. She was a single mother. Marcus, the opinionated toddler, was hers, and she also had a daughter, Priya, who was 7, blessed with her mother's expressive eyes and her own very definite thoughts on almost everything. There was no husband, or indeed any significant male partner, currently in the picture. Layla didn't offer details, and I, at 91, understood implicitly that not every story requires its full, exhaustive context to be deeply understood. The crucial, undeniable fact was this: she was alone, navigating a brand new city with 2 small, dependent children, an increasingly desperate job search, and absolutely no one to call at 7 in the morning when Marcus awoke with a raging fever and Priya still needed to be dropped off at school. She had no one to call. That, more than anything, resonated with me, striking a chord so deep it thrummed through my very bones. Oh, I had known that feeling. I had been that person, not at 29, certainly. Gerald and I were inextricably linked by that age, for better or worse, and some days, undoubtedly, both. But after Gerald died, when my children had grown and established their own busy lives an hour's drive away, when the telephone often felt like a mere prop in a play, and the morning stretched out in such an unbearable quietness that it made my teeth ache with a strange phantom pain, I knew the precise contours of that particular, isolating loneliness. I recognized it in Layla as intimately as you recognize a language you once spoke fluently, a forgotten tongue suddenly brought back to life. And so, we started small. She would begin, tentatively, by knocking on my door some mornings. Priya needed to be at school by 8:15. Marcus was feverish, a hot, restless bundle. Could he just stay with me for an hour, she'd ask, her voice laced with exhaustion and apology, while she managed the school run? Of course, I would reply, the words feeling utterly natural on my tongue. Of course he can. Marcus, it must be stated, was not what one would describe as a placid child. He possessed, as I've mentioned, a robust collection of opinions. Opinions about what was acceptable to eat, what was permissible to touch, and precisely where everything in the universe ought to reside. Indeed, some of those opinions, when expressed with full toddler force, verged on the physically dangerous. But he was also wonderfully warm, fiercely curious, a small dynamo of life. He would press his entire face, a smudge of juice and pure wonder against the cool glass of my cabinet, where I kept the delicate blue dishes, Gerald's mother's dishes, the ones I never used, too precious for everyday wear, and breathe on it, watching his own foggy reflection coalesce and dissipate as if it were the most fascinating phenomenon he had ever encountered. I found that utterly, unbearably lovable. I still do. And Priya was 7, an age I have always considered profoundly underrated. 7-year-olds are perfectly old enough to engage in genuine, surprisingly profound conversations, yet still young enough to find an old woman like me intriguing rather than simply embarrassing. She would often settle herself at my kitchen table, her small legs swinging, diligently working on her homework while I prepared my dinner. My dinner, that is, the late dinner I had comfortably reverted to, now that no one else's schedule dictated my mealtime. She would ask me questions with the unfiltered directness only a 7-year-old possesses, utterly unconcerned with the niceties of what might be considered appropriate. She asked me why my hands sometimes trembled. She inquired, with wide, serious eyes, if I had been alive during the war. She even asked me, with a compelling, childlike logic born from examining old black and white photographs, if it was true that people used to have black and white vision. One day, she looked at me with an almost heartbreaking solemnity and asked if I was afraid of dying. A little, I confessed, my gaze meeting hers. But mostly, by 9 o'clock, I'm just very, very tired. That unexpected honesty made her laugh so hard she nearly tumbled off her chair, a pure, uninhibited peal of joy. I hadn't provoked such unadulterated laughter from a 7-year-old in years. I hadn't realized how deeply I had missed it, how vital that sound was. Layla, in turn, began to check on me, not in Margaret's way, not with the clipped concern of a clipboard and a list of options, not with the heavy, pervasive weight of worry pressing against every word she uttered. She simply knocked. She would sometimes bring things, a container of whatever she had prepared for dinner, which was often surprisingly good, and occasionally, to be frank, rather alarming. She went through a memorable phase involving something called shakshuka, about which I still harbor mixed feelings. She would sit in my kitchen while I made us tea, and she would talk, truly talk, the way people used to converse before every available silence was swallowed by the glow of a phone screen. She spoke about her mother, who lived far away and was ailing, about the elusive job she was relentlessly pursuing, about Marcus's father, the fragments of that story emerging over time without a trace of self-pity, yet equally without any pretense. She shared her fears, the raw, unpolished ones. She was afraid she wasn't enough for her children. She was terrified the money wouldn't last. She was afraid she had made a monumental mistake by moving here, and the terrifying truth was there was no way yet to know if she had, and I recognized all of it. The specific circumstances of her life and mine were separated by 6 decades, by more societal shifts than either of us could fully articulate or account for. But fear, I realized, arranges itself in the very same knot in a woman's chest. In 1967, as it does in 2018. I know that now with an undeniable certainty. Fear, it turns out, is stubbornly archaic. It simply doesn't update its methods. I too began to share things with her. Stories I hadn't uttered aloud in a very long time, simply because there had been no one left to tell them to, or the people I might have told were now gone. I told her about Gerald, the real Gerald, you understand, not the idealized, sanded down version one presents at funerals, but the complex, brilliant, sometimes selfish man who loved me in ways that were imperfect, yes, but undeniably real and profound. I recounted the year after he died, how I would stubbornly leave his coffee cup on the counter every morning, simply because I wasn't ready to put it away yet, a small, daily act of quiet grief and defiance. I told her about my friend Dorothy Sable, a loss from which I have never fully recovered. Dorothy, who was funnier than anyone I have ever had the privilege of knowing, who died of a stroke at 78 in the middle of a sentence, which, her daughter later observed, was precisely how Dorothy would have chosen to go. I hadn't spoken about Dorothy to anyone in years, because the people who remembered her, who shared those vivid memories with me, were mostly gone too. Layla didn't know Dorothy, but she listened, and that, in its profound simplicity, was enough. It might have been more than enough. It might have been precisely what I needed. By spring, an almost imperceptible shift had occurred in the atmosphere around me, and within me, changes that were challenging to articulate in precise terms, yet utterly impossible to ignore. I found myself watching Marcus 2 mornings a week, freeing Layla to attend job interviews, my lap once again a familiar, warm haven for a small, demanding person. Layla's daughter, Priya, developed a charming habit of stopping by my door on her way home from school. Just to say hello, she would always declare, just to see if you needed anything. Though she was 7, then 8, then eventually 9, I understood that what she truly needed was simply to sit in a quiet, calm kitchen with someone who wasn't perpetually stressed, someone who had the time to truly listen, and that, I realized with a quiet sense of purpose, was something I could wholeheartedly give her. Layla, in turn, began to help me with my grocery shopping, a task that I will readily admit had become genuinely challenging. Not the choosing, mind you. I can still select a perfectly ripe tomato with an unerring precision that would put younger shoppers to shame, but the physical logistics, the carrying, the lifting, the sheer effort required by a body that no longer consistently cooperated had become a quiet source of frustration. She changed a stubbornly burned-out light bulb that I had been pointedly ignoring for 6 weeks. A mute testament to the fact that my step stool and I were no longer on speaking terms, its wobbly legs now a perilous proposition. I, in a display of persistent, stubborn resolve, managed to kill her basil plants 3 consecutive times before, finally, triumphantly, I succeeded in growing her a new one from a clipping of my own. A small victory, but one that filled me with a disproportionate sense of pride. We were not, I want to be very precise about this, a family in the conventional genetic sense of the word. The term family, I've come to understand, can often crowd out other, more nuanced words that might capture the essence of certain relationships more accurately. We were, I believe, something far bolder or perhaps simply differently shaped. We were neighbors in the truest original meaning of that word. We were people who recognized a mutual need, who consistently showed up for each other, who offered help and asked for it without transforming every interaction into a grand production or an elaborate favor. My mother's generation, I feel certain, would have recognized this dynamic immediately, understanding its inherent logic. My own generation, however, often recognized it with a subtle pang of grief because we had become so preoccupied with constructing lives that meticulously insulated us from one another that we had, perhaps, forgotten this fundamental truth. This was simply how people used to live. This was, quite literally, how people used to survive. Margaret visited that April. She stayed for a long weekend. On Saturday afternoon, Layla, with Marcus perched comfortably on her hip, knocked on my door with a tentative question about whether I had a moment. I did, of course. That casual inquiry blossomed into an hour-long conversation between Layla and Margaret at my kitchen table, discussing some television program they both happened to be watching. All the while, Marcus, true to form, was diligently attempting to fit an entire wooden spoon into his mouth, while I quietly made tea, and Priya, utterly absorbed, read a book in the corner, her legs draped casually over the arm of the chair. The unmistakable posture of a child who feels utterly comfortable and at home. Margaret was uncharacteristically quiet on Sunday morning. Before she left, she paused, her hand on the doorknob, and said, "Mom, you seem..." She stopped, searching for the right words. I waited, holding my breath. Then she finished, "You seem like yourself." I honestly didn't know what to say in response to that. It hadn't consciously occurred to me that I had stopped seeming like myself, but upon reflection, I believe she was profoundly right. I think that somewhere within those preceding months, in the simple, profound business of being useful, of being genuinely needed, of being honest with someone, and crucially, of being truly listened to in return, I had gradually reconnected with something I had been drifting from. Not the person I was when I was young, certainly. You can never truly go back, and frankly, I've never harbored any desire to. There is far too much I know now, too much wisdom gained that I simply didn't possess then. But I had refound the person I had always been even when I was most authentically myself. Stubborn, endlessly interested in the world, particular about my tomatoes, and yes, willing to kill 3 basil plants before finally getting it right. I am 91 years old. I live alone in my house, and I will be candid. I am still, most days, afraid. The anxieties of aging do not simply vanish. But what I have discovered through this unexpected journey is that fear itself is not the ultimate determinant of whether you live well. What truly determines whether you live well is a conscious, deliberate choice you make every single day. The decision to keep reaching across the invisible spaces that often divide you from another human being, and to offer whatever you still possess, whatever small fragment of yourself you have left to give. I couldn't provide my daughter with a mother who magically didn't need anything. I couldn't become the compliant, managed woman Brenda's agency expected. I couldn't transform into a resident who cheerfully handed over the last vestiges of her own authority to that bright, scheduled community with its 2 o'clock films. But I absolutely could, hold a paper bag for a tired young woman wrestling with the chaos of motherhood at a mailbox. I could watch a toddler for 2 precious hours, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated wonder in his eyes as he breathed on cabinet glass. I could sit across a worn kitchen table and share my truth, the messy, complicated truth of my life, and in return, listen as another human being offered her truth, finding in that mutual exchange a profound sense of communion that left both of us feeling a little less alone in the vast, bewildering world. That, in its beautiful, organic simplicity, is what I found when all the conventional options had finally run out. It wasn't a solution in the neat packaged sense of the word. It was something far older, something that existed long before we started assigning such clinical labels to the fundamental ways humans connect. It was community, the old kind, the kind that spills out of mere proximity, out of shared need, and out of the simple, courageous willingness to knock on a neighbor's door. I still experience hard days, of course. Life, even at 91, refuses to be entirely smooth. I fell last January, right there in the hallway, not the bathroom, mind you, and I appreciate the small dignity of that distinction. I lay there for a moment, flat on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, and a thought remarkably clear and chilling materialized in my mind. This is it. This is the moment Margaret warned me about. And then just as clearly, another thought followed. I'm fine. I'm not hurt. I'm going to get up. And I did. It took a while, a slow, deliberate struggle, but I did. I didn't tell Margaret for 2 weeks. I knew she would worry, would descend with her clipboards and her options. I don't pretend to know how long this beautiful makeshift arrangement will last. Bodies, after all, have their own relentless schedules, and they rarely consult you. Some morning, I will undoubtedly wake up, and the step stool and I will face a more serious, irreversible disagreement, or something else will transpire that is less recoverable, and then the question of what comes next will have to be confronted in earnest. I know that. I have been 91 years on this earth. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand how stories eventually conclude. But here is what I know with absolute certainty, right now, in this particular afternoon, from the comforting embrace of this green armchair that still unapologetically clashes with everything. I am not managed. I am not a schedule problem. I am not Mrs. Marrow to well-meaning strangers. I am Cecily, and I made my own lunch today. This morning, Priya, with her 7-year-old grin, knocked on my door to proudly show me she had lost another tooth. And Marcus, who is now 3 and possesses firm opinions about absolutely everything, has apparently decided that I am his best friend, a declaration he announced to Layla last week, entirely unprompted, and which I found so unexpectedly, overwhelmingly moving that I had to pretend I was searching for something in the kitchen so she wouldn't see the sudden, glistening tears in my eyes. So, I offer this to you as a suggestion, not a mandate. Don't simply resign yourself to being taken care of before you have exhausted every other possibility, every other avenue of connection, before you have tried knocking on a door, before you have held a paper bag for a stranger, before you have sat across a kitchen table from someone who is struggling, perhaps in a different direction than you are, and discovered, to your profound surprise, that 2 struggles faced together are often, miraculously, lighter than one endured alone. I am not telling you that it is easy. I am not telling you that it solves everything. I am 91 years old, and I am long past pretending that anything in this life solves everything. But I am still here, in my own house, in my own armchair, with my late dinner, and the comforting chaos of my grandchildren on Sundays, and the welcome sound of my neighbor's children's footsteps on my porch, and my blue dishes still resting, untouched yet cherished, behind the glass where they belong. That is enough. That, I have finally understood, is exactly enough.